We good? Good. Okay, folks, sorry for the little delay, but don't we all just love technology? I'm Terry Williams. I'm president of the Keene Sentinel, and I'd like to welcome you all to the journalism track of Radically Rural. This is our 5th year of providing sessions on community journalism, and these have all been aimed at helping journalists at small news organizations be more successful in their work and newsrooms be more sustainable during a time in which we are feeling great stress, whether that be in retaining our audiences or building trust with folks. I welcome our in-person audience. They probably have heard a lot of this conversation already, and those who are attending virtually. In a few minutes, we'll begin our first session covering the divide, and that will be followed later in the afternoon by a presentation and discussion on how we might better and more equitably cover justice. As has been the case every year, the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communication at Franklin Pierce University is sponsoring the community journalism track. Students from the school are also providing coverage of Radically Rural and will help produce a 16-page tab that the Sentinel will print tomorrow morning and give out to all of our attendees. Dr. Kristen Nevius, director of the school, is with us to say a few words of welcome. Dr. Nevius.
Thank you, Terry, for giving Franklin Pierce University and the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communication the opportunity to again support today's discussion of the role of local journalism in building rural communities. In 2022, as the Fitzwater Center enters its 3rd decade and Franklin Pierce University begins its 7th decade, we remain committed to a core set of values, and that has informed our commitment to Radically Rural and the community journalism track. The Fitzwater Center has come to fully recognize over the past 2 years that there is one core value that is especially and profoundly powerful and critically fundamental to realizing our mission, and that value is of service. We believe that commitment to service is the thread that binds all of us here today. Service to our profession, our communities, and to each other as human beings. As we faced a global pandemic that overwhelmed our world with frightening speed, as we faced social upheaval, economic uncertainty, and pervasive political divides. The Fitzwater Center is proud to be a founding member and academic partner of the Granite State News Collaborative. The collaborative is the embodiment of service. Its ability to leverage the resources of the state's news outlets and community partners to provide critically deep coverage of the pandemic inspired the creation of the Fitzwater Medallion for Public Service, which was presented in April at the Fitzwater Honors this year. When the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic on March 11, 2020, what happened in New Hampshire's newsrooms was something that was happening in newsrooms around the world. Within a day, the collaborative had made a decisive pivot to COVID-19 coverage. In an announcement published March 13th, Carol Robideau, publisher and editor of Manchester Ink Link and collaborative co-founder, was quoted, "Leveraging the reach and reliability of New Hampshire's news professionals to localize coverage when an international story emerges is what the collaborative and journalism is all about." Collaborative president and co-founder Dawn DeAngelis, vice president and chief content officer of New Hampshire PBS, notes that the collaborative produced some of the most deep and meaningful content not seen for many years in New Hampshire. This unprecedented transformation of the state's journalism ecosystem in response to unprecedented stressors was a transformation that yielded something stronger than the sum of its parts, and it illustrated the power of community journalism. We, Franklin Pierce University and the Marlin Fitzwater Center, are proud to be able to collaborate with you today in important conversations. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Nevius. I also want to acknowledge the support of the Knight Foundation, which again this year provided underwriting support for us to bring rural journalists to this conference, both in person and online. And also I want to thank my friends at the New England Newspaper and Press Association for their help in promoting this event. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. For those of you who are here, help yourself to coffee, water, soft drinks that are out in the lobby. That's also where the restrooms can be found if you need those. Those attending online, please feel free to use the chat function to send in questions. We have someone monitoring these, and they will be read to our speakers at various points in the program. For those of you who are in person with me who want to ask questions, we do have a microphone, so please let me get to you let us get to you so that the recording and those online will capture your question. If you are here and you want to log into the session through the Socio platform so that you can view the chat, just make sure that your device sound is turned down so we don't get reverberation. The Wi-Fi password here is the showroom guest, lobby guest, and the password is applause with a capital A in case you need to use that. For anyone that has general questions about Radically Rural and I can't answer them, there's a help desk inside the Colonial Performing Arts Center where we started the day. And for those of you who are here tomorrow, we are providing a tour of the Sentinel, which is just a few minutes walk from here. At about 10:15 or 10:30 or so, you'll be able to see in person a press run, have some coffee with us, continue to network. So if that is of interest to you, we gladly invite you. Now for our first session, Covering the Divide. I would say most of us have experienced the challenges of covering communities divided over race, education, the pandemic and masking, policing, and more. I've been in journalism for 44 years, and I cannot recall a more fractured time. Today we hope to get at some of these issues and have a discussion on how we can do our jobs in these challenging times and how our reporting can be of more and broader use to our citizens. Elizabeth Stevens, who is moderating the discussion, is the executive director for the Columbia Missourian and the community newspaper chair at the Missouri School of Journalism. She is an associate professor and has led audience engagement and digital efforts at the Missourian. In her role as digital director at KOMU, she oversaw digital strategy and trained digital producers. Previously, she worked as an editor at the SNL Financial in Charlottesville, Virginia, and as a copy desk chief at the Columbus, Georgia Ledger-Enquirer. She holds both a master's and bachelor's degree from the University of Missouri. She is joined by panelists Tony Baranowski, manager of special projects at the Cedar Rapids Gazette in Iowa. Tony is with us in person. Sara Konrad Baranowski, the deputy manager editor at the Cedar Rapids Gazette, is also with us, and she'll be joining us online. And we are also joined by Peter Huoppi, director for multimedia for The Day in New London, Connecticut. He is also the co-producer of the documentary Those People, and you should be able to see a clip of that today as part of this presentation. So join me in welcoming Elizabeth, Tony, Sara, and Peter.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction, Terry, and I'm excited to be here. First time in New Hampshire. This is a great town to be in, and feel lucky to have met some of you already. Hope to meet more of you as the next day or two unfolds. As our speaker this morning talked about, and Terry mentioned as well, the divisions across the country and in our own communities are greater than we've seen. As journalists, we have an opportunity to make sure we aren't creating further divisions and broaden our sources and relationships in the community to give more perspectives and understanding of the community. We're going to talk a little bit about Trusting News, which is a project committed to research and understanding of trust in news and turning that into actionable items for journalists. One of the most recent projects they did was A Road to Pluralism. And this project seeks to understand the societal and psychological forces that influences polarizations and perception of news. It's based around, kind of like our keynote speaker was talking about, having conversations, finding common ground, and understanding what people are looking for and what they need to understand about how news works. Our panelists participated in a road to pluralism through their newsrooms, some past, some current. They conducted interviews with community members to better understand the divide and put into practice the actionable items learned from the research. In addition, Peter Huoppi of The Day in New London has an example of collaborating with the Black community that hasn't been represented well by the media. I will have them talk more about those projects during this session. I wanted to share some of the research from Trusting News so we can start to see this disconnect and where distrust in media has impacted this divide. So this initial information is from a Gallup poll from 2021, and you see this drop in trust in U.S. news media. It's at its lowest point since 2016. So we're seeing this decline. But what I find interesting to note is the way that we saw these drops in trust over the last few decades, that it's not all attributed to the internet. Yes, we saw some significant drops between the 90s and the 2016, but you see that drop between the 1977 and 1997, which was in part from the addition of cable, which created more choice. We have more, there's deregulation, there's partisan shows. That language of division really becomes part of the conversation more broadly that politicians latch onto and others. The research being done, they've looked at it, the trust around news and how it breaks down by political party. So we see this kind of further entrenchment into these divisions that we are seeing in our communities. So when you can't even agree on trusting the media that you're consuming, it's tricky to come to a common ground and believe the same facts at play. What I think is important for local journalists is to know that people view things differently in their own communities, that they do look at their local newspapers, their local journalists differently than they do the media or the national media. So there is more trust in our local outlets, and I think it's important that we continue to hold on to that and build on that trust, and that's where this project really leads to. Let's see. So another space where we see kind of how this breaks down, they look at how the racial divide and how things vary when it comes to race in terms of trust in media. And you see that there's some general trust, but it's more about people, especially people of color, not trusting media when the media is covering them, that it's not they aren't fairly represented in the coverage. And so that's something Peter has much more to talk about with that. I want to also talk about the urban-rural divide, which is what we at the University of Missouri, through our newsrooms, have spent a fair amount of time working on and talking about. So Columbia, Missouri is kind of uniquely positioned in Missouri in the Midwest. I have a colleague who refers to it as the San Andreas Fault for political polarization. So we are right there in the middle of the state, and Boone County, where Columbia and the university is, voted for Biden by 54% of the vote. The 7 counties around us that touch Boone County voted for Trump by more than 66%. So Columbia stands out in the state, and we see that rural-urban divide all around us. Our students are coming in from various places and backgrounds, and they bring additional experiences and perspectives to the newsrooms they're working in. So some of the things we have done to help everyone kind of understand each other better across rural and urban experiences has been, one of them was a project from our NPR affiliate, Missouri on Mic. And they spent time, they did this around the bicentennial and have continued to do it because it's been a successful project. And it's really about people telling their own stories and getting to be, instead of the journalist asking them questions and then putting it together in a story, it's truly just the person sharing their own story. They set up some, but it's kind of open-ended they approach it. And this content is shared on the radio, which covers a pretty wide range of central Missouri, as well as online. Spring, there was a team that worked across several disciplines to take a closer look at communities with fewer than 2,500 people in them. So one of those communities was Milan, Missouri, which has the highest percentage of Hispanic. The Missourian had spent some time in that community during the pandemic when there were concerns about COVID safety and the meat processing plant in the community. This team of reporters last spring returned and wanted to spend time with the community and do their best to shoot in and out. Reporters were able to connect with a community leader that introduced them to community members. The team included a native Spanish speaker and a couple of students who had experience speaking Spanish. So those interviews were conducted in Spanish. We had both English versions of the story and Spanish versions of the stories, as well as videos. We invited the community members to submit their own stories, tell their own stories online. We had self-addressed stamped envelopes that they could write to us back. So we wanted them to be something that we did about them. There were two primary stories we worked on, and one was about this meat processing plant and what that meant for jobs and growth in the community. The second was about the way the demographics of the community had changed and how it's shaped the town's future. In addition, the student who was a native Spanish speaker and a photographer spent time at community events, got to know more people in the town. They were able to tell additional stories, including one about a special prom experience and the importance of a soccer league within that community. One of the missions of the project was to share these stories with a broader audience through the and our other outlets. Tell their story, see it, and in the town's newspaper, publish the stories with us. One more example of this effort on covering the rural-urban divide here back in Missouri is something that is just 2020, but we're kicking off a larger version of this opportunity with the news ambassadors. So with this, there will be a town hall meeting in Moberly, Missouri, which is about 45 miles north of Columbia. And there's a similar meeting held in Flatbush and Brooklyn. The goal of the meetings is to have the residents share the issues that are most important to them. So the journalists in each location will differences and dig a lot deeper and how it's impacting each community. The goal is to let the community kind of define those issues and not go in assuming we know the issues that are in that community in either place, and also look in Missouri, understand people in Brooklyn, and vice versa, and what that, even though viewed through different lenses probably. So that's ongoing, or just beginning to hold that town hall meeting and get that off the ground. So those are some of the things we have been doing out in Missouri and that we're continuing to do. I was with someone who said they had heard from people that had read our 2500 Below project, and they said, when are they coming to my town? Work in these communities. This News Ambassadors project, be able to report back on that. But now that I've talked about what's been on in Missouri, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists and hear about their work and what Covering the Divide has looked like for them. So we're gonna kick off with Peter. You want to just talk for a minute before we do the video? Or how are you going?
Yeah. I'm going to divide in our communities. I work in around the same size as Key. Our city is majority Black and Hispanic. Our newsroom is majority white. And I think the obvious solutions that unfortunately I'd have a lot to say about is to work on more diversity in your hiring. Hire people who have similar life experiences to the communities that you're trying to cover. Especially at a small newspaper in a small city, that's a slow process to make change there. So that being said, I do want to acknowledge that I am fully aware of my identity as a white man from the suburbs, and I'm not going to sit up here and claim to be an expert in covering the Black and Hispanic communities. But I do want to share just some experiences that I've had, and one project that we worked on that was a collaboration with some of the residents and members in our community that I think was a successful experience in using our platform and the abilities that we had in our newsroom to sort of help bridge that racial divide. So I'm going to play a trailer for a documentary that we did.
Okay. Do we have audio? Do I need to? Come on.
I'm going to try to get sound with it.
A murder in the heart of the city.
I'm angry.
I'm frightened.
You guys strengthen the things that are negative, and you don't bring light to the good.
Everybody complains when something happens, and we have a couple meetings, and then it stops.
New London took on this tag as being one of the bad places. Killings always go on there.
We can't go down there because those people live there.
Because of my skin color, I'm now part of those people.
I've definitely had bad experiences with police.
Walking down the street and a police telling me it's past my curfew.
The headline was that the kids had said that they were bored. It couldn't be any more, clear, that we needed something to combat boredom.
Something about when you put someone on the spot in the right moment, under those conditions, how do you say no? How do you say no to someone who represents those people, saying, let's do something good?
Their notion of success was filling up the place, and that's what they did.
To see all the town in this guard theater, that's my moment.
To know for 9 years we've been building the opposite of what people expect for us, we did something good.
All right, so the documentary is...
The city was being torn apart.
The documentary is called Those People. It's about 70 minutes long, and it's part of the online portion of the Monadnock International Film Festival, which starts off this week. So that is one place that you can go check it out starting this weekend, I believe. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the collaboration here. Can you go back one slide?
Yep. Sorry.
So the documentary was not just my work. It was work that we did in collaboration with members of the community. And so I want to talk a little, first of all, give a little bit of some context for the divide that we're facing at the Day and in New London. So the protest photo should be the first one.
Looks like it got lost somewhere. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, sorry. Current slide. I'm not getting it pop-ups. Oh, sorry. You can just keep going.
Okay. All right. So the photo that I wanted to show you was from a protest in the summer of 2020, and it was a young person in our city holding a sign that says, "Media like the Day newspaper engage in and perpetuate anti-black / urban boogeyman narratives to make money." And seeing that out in public at a protest, being called out like that, like really, really hit me hard. And sometimes I think when we talk about criticism like that, we chalk it up to a problem of perception. This is somebody who only selectively sees what we do as journalists. They don't really understand what we're out there doing. Like, we are not trying to be here to capitalize on people's grief and the bad things in our communities just to make money. But I think that this sort of rings true and sums up the divide along racial lines that we're facing. So some context for this documentary, if you want to go next. So in the fall of 2010, 6 teenagers in New London were arrested for stabbing to death a 20-year-old city named Matthew Chu, who was walking home from work late one night. And the reaction in our city was one of a lot of fear and anger, and some people, rightly so, criticized the Day for being a part of stoking that anger and stoking that fear. We published, this is from an inside page, the mugshots of the 6 attackers when they were arrested. And then when they were arraigned, we published this on the front page of the paper, made a big display of that. And so I look back at this and question, were we just reporting the news, or are we actively perpetuating the urban boogeyman narrative? So in the aftermath of this crime, here's some examples of stories that we ran on our front page. So we went with New London Police on a ride along. We went for a walk with an anti-violence patrol out late at night in the city. We interviewed downtown residents, most, if not all, of whom were white and middle class, talking about how they're afraid to live in downtown and how they wanted to move out of the city. And we went to a lot of these meetings with community members talking about what are we going to do now. Also in the comments section, we published some comments from readers using words like animals, thugs, lowlifes, project kids. So again, are we just reporting the news? Are we just providing a neutral space for community discussion, or are we actively perpetuating an urban boogeyman narrative in order to make money and be successful as a business? So the one sort of successful thing that came out of these meetings was a talent show event that was meant to provide a space for kids in the city who didn't have an outlet, who couldn't afford dance lessons or private music lessons. And it was a real positive event in the community. The feature story that we ran about it ran only in our New London Times weekly newspaper. It was not on the front page of the day. So, this became a much beloved in the city annual event. I covered the event every year. A quote from one of the stories covering this event. It is the talent show highlighted the richness of diversity sometimes overlooked in the community. 2017, we ran photos on either the front page or the region front, previewing the talent show. Both photos were of the same suburban white guitar player. And so I'm paraphrasing here a little bit at the bottom, but we heard some feedback from a community member who said, of course, the day wouldn't publish a positive depiction of a black kid on the front page. They would choose this white kid from the suburbs. So this was right about the time that I was starting to think about a topic for my master's thesis. And so I wondered, was this just a perception, or could we actually quantify how we depict people in our newspaper, in our community, based on race? So a couple of summarizing charts here. So on the left, so I did a content analysis of 6 local daily newspapers around the country and compared the race of subjects who appeared in local news photos with the census breakdown of the communities that they cover. And so on the left, adding all together, we see that the white population is overrepresented in news photos, while non-white populations were all underrepresented by a statistically significant margin. I also looked at a couple of stereotypical roles that some previous research had identified, and found that black subjects were disproportionately overrepresented in the role of criminal and athlete, while white subjects were underrepresented in those roles. So basically, the way if you were black, the way you got into the pages of the newspaper were by being the basketball star or by being arrested for a violent crime. So this was around the same time that 2 of the founders of this talent show approached me and said, hey, we've got an idea for a documentary. And I'm guessing that a lot of you guys, if you're a journalist, you get story pitches from people all the time. And I certainly do, and have to sort of evaluate, is this a story that is worth my time? Is this something that our audience should know or is going to want to know about, or is this just somebody who has their own pet project that's looking for publicity for it? And I was a little bit skeptical at first because we had covered the talent show an awful lot. But I heard 2 things that made me think that this was a project that was worth our time. One, the founders of the show, Curtis and Frank, told me some of the backstories of the participants that I had never heard. We had always covered it as this is a nice, positive event that has its founding in the wake of a murder, and it's a good opportunity for youth. It brings people together. But I heard stories of a young, poor dancer who had used the talent show to launch his professional dance career and is now a dancer for the the Brooklyn Nets. I heard about a man who had been in the midst of addiction recovery and felt like his participation in the talent show had set him on the right track. There was a young victim of violence who had suffered a traumatic brain injury and was using rap music as therapy to help him get back to speaking properly. And I also heard that the day had given a platform for people who were scared of violent crime in the city, but hadn't given a platform to people like these founders of the talent show who, as a result of the outcry, had to deal with more aggressive policing, felt like they were stereotyped by outsiders, that their only representation in people's minds were the mugshots on the page of the newspaper, and they were lumped in with them. So about 2017, 2018, I sat down to start conducting interviews for this. And like, I really, really felt like an outsider. And I wanted to sit down and talk to people about their experiences with issues of race and crime and police and community relations. And there was I sensed a real reluctance. Like, people would say like, oh no, it's not that bad, everything's fine. And so I sort of thought to myself, like, were people looking at me and saying, like, why should I trust you as someone who's not a part of my community and doesn't have my life experience to share my story when the organization that you work for, the only time that they show people who look like me are for crimes or for being the star of the football team. So really quickly, I got back together with Curtis, who is on the left here, and Frank, who's on the top right, and said, like, how can we work together to make sure that to make these stories be told in an authentic way? So normally, as a journalist in the community, I go talk to you, you give me your information, and then that's the last input you have in it. I go back to my workspace and I work on it. People call and say, oh, can I see the story before it's published? And we say, nope. Can I look at my quotes? No, I'm sorry, we don't allow that. There's a good reason to do that, but I think that sort of journalistic standard also stands as a barrier to trust with underrepresented communities. So I wanted to sort of open up the process. So Curtis and Frank sort of acted alongside me as journalists in this project. Curtis sat in with me and conducted a lot of the interviews. A bunch of the participants in the show worked with me to write the script. Normally, if this were a news package, like, I would write the narration and deliver the narration. But I felt really strongly like this is not my story. So the narrator was one of the coaches and performers from the talent show. And then as I worked on the rough draft, like, we met periodically to look at drafts of this story. I met with our executive editor and our publisher and asked for permission to do this because this was really like outside the bounds of how we would normally do journalism. And so we sort of set the ground rules that as far as like editorial oversight, the day would have the final say if there was any disagreements. Well, there were never any disagreements, and that input really like only helped make the story better and more authentic. There was one instance that I want to share, and I'm going to see if I can play off of my speakers over the microphone here, because I didn't get it into the PowerPoint. But I was talking to a young Native American woman about her art and her music, and we had been talking to people about labels and perceptions and how this artistic space allowed you to sort of step beyond that. And I don't remember exactly how I phrased the question, but I asked her, like, do people have perceptions of you as a Native American performer? And she was like, no, you know, my art and my ethnic identity are separate things. And then Curtis was in there for the interview, and with him, because he was present, it was a more comfortable and open conversation. And he asked a similar question, and because she was talking to somebody who had a similar life experience, opened up a little bit more. And it's kind of one of my favorite quotes, one of my favorite moments. So hopefully you can hear this.
I want everybody to know exactly who I am. I am Native American, and I can sing R&B music. It's not just because I'm Native American, I'm going to sing like when I say, oh, I sing, and then someone's like, well, you're Native, so you sing like, ah. No, I sing like, whoa.
And so, I mean, I feel like I'm an experienced journalist. I'm a good interviewer. But when you've got these barriers to overcome, I think that there is something to be said for letting people participate in the process and understand the process and have some say in how they tell their own story. So as far as like the results for this, we've had a few in-person showings. We had a premiere screening at the Guard Theatre in New London where we had 500 people. Someone came up to me and told me that this was the best thing that the day has ever done for the community. I feel like that maybe is overstating things a little bit, but it was a real positive experience and shared a whole bunch of stories that had never gotten in the newspaper and shared them in a way that made it seem really, really big and important. So I'm not going to sit up here and say that everybody should go back to where you work and spend 3 years on and off working on a feature-length documentary. Like, that might not be in the cards for you. But I feel like there are lessons here that we can take away from it. So getting back to the protests in the summer of 2020. So here's a couple of stills from my video coverage of these protests. And I heard from people that said, like, you are framing this as strife and divide, and you're just trying to divide the community and take advantage of that. I also heard from participants in the protest that were really skeptical of my motives. So in the upper right here, this was video footage of some of the protesters spray painting a statue of Christopher Columbus. And I took a ton of crap because I think people, I didn't have a chance to talk and delve deeper into the reasons for this. And I talked to some people who, maybe rightly so, thought that I was there to record this to try to hold them accountable and try to, like, make sure that the police had a record of this vandalism. So one thing that some of my colleagues did that I think worked really well is going deeper beyond the coverage of these protests, making sure that we can take the time and sit down with people and let them tell their own stories. Not rely on us to just take publicly available images, video footage, and put it out there, but spend the time to hear what are the reasons in your life that make you want to come out here. What kind of change are you trying to accomplish? And I think this was better. It's still important to go out and report those daily news stories, but this paints a much better, well-rounded, more in-depth picture of these stories. And so I've got on this last screen just a QR code if you want to link to watch the documentary online. So that's where you can find it on our platforms, but it's also going to be in the Monadnock International Film Festival, which is, I think, moniff.org. And it's online only for Monadnock, but you can see it there too. So we'll turn it over to Tony now.
Thanks, Peter. So we're going to try to bring Sara in.
Yeah, if you can, that'd be great.
Our master's in the upper.
So Sara was supposed to be here with us this week. We had a child get sick last week. And I won well, I'm not sure who got the short straw, really.
There she is.
Hey, Sara.
Say something.
Okay, can you hear me?
Nope.
No. Testing. It looks like there's a delay on my end.
Tony, you want to talk a little bit about where you all are coming from and what that's...
Okay.
Start from there.
Still nothing, Sara. Keep talking. You just keep moving your lips until something comes out.
So first of all, Sara put together our slides because you guys, I hate slideshows. I hate them so much, and it's been a big part of my new job, working on slideshows. So she put together our part of this presentation. Hopefully we can get her to go. But Sara and I, obviously married couple, met while we were in college at the University of Northern Iowa. And we worked together for 17 years at a small rural newspaper in North called the Iowa Falls Times-Citizen. Recently relocated to Cedar Rapids, which is not as rural as Iowa goes. We were having this conversation last night. Some people would consider Cedar Rapids rural if you're from kind of reasonably sized city. We do not anymore. I have I go to a movie and stuff like that. It's great. It's great. The reason we moved is happened at our previous employer. Became apparent we either needed to buy it or we needed to find a new place to go. And the Gazette is an ESOP. It's independent, and there just aren't that many newspapers who have opportunities for at this point anymore. So
I think we just heard you, Sarah.
you on there?
Oh, you did? Oh, you did?
Yay!
Hello?
All right. So anyway, we participated at the Times-Citizen in some of these trusting news things that Elizabeth mentioned earlier. It was really enlightening, and also just as far as how it dictated change within our news organization. We definitely did some things different coverage-wise, but it also made us just think a little bit more about what we were blasting out across the front page in the same kinds of ways that Peter was talking about, and what the perception was and how that would impact overall trust of our organization. Now, one thing I would say is Elizabeth showed some of those stats about trust of various media. One thing that, at least in Iowa, we have seen is trust is actually on the rise for media across the board in recent years, but especially for community newspapers. Print newspapers are actually regaining people's faith. And at the community journalism level, I'm not sure that we ever really lost their faith, because when we went through the Trusting News program, what we heard over and over is, I don't trust the mainstream media, but they don't even think of us as media. They think of us as their neighbors and part of their community. Now, are they critical of us at times? Absolutely. Do they still have perception that we are left-wing or liberal? Sometimes. But they also don't hold that kind of deep personal grudge that, at least generally speaking, that they do against the quote-unquote mainstream media. Anyway, I'm going to let Sarah talk about some slides now.
Should I share my screen?
If you can, because they can't see ours at the moment, so.
I will try to do that. Apologies.
That's just you.
I'll give it one more try, and if it doesn't work, I'll just plow on ahead.
You're up.
Here we go.
Don't do anything different.
Oh.
Yeah. There.
Oh, is she frozen
Can you
now?
still see it?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
But I'm frozen.
That's okay. We don't need to see you move. We can hear you.
Now we're good. Go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, perfect. I'm just gonna go ahead and talk. There's a delay, so it might seem a little bit weird. Only for me. So Tony calls her jobs at the Times-Citizen in Hardin County, Iowa. This first slide, which hopefully you can see, shows Hardin County. The population is just under 17,000 people, and I put up the registered voters numbers so that you get an idea. It is a pretty red county. It's conservative in almost every aspect and has become more conservative in recent years. Can you still hear me? Hopefully you can still hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, it froze up for me. Sorry about that. For us, there were two central kinds of complaints that we hear at the Times-Citizen. There were people who didn't know where to go for information, or we would report information and they said, when was this public meeting? I didn't know anything about it. I don't know what the city's doing. Why are they spending this money? Which kind of baffled us because we're reporting this news all the time. We're attending public meetings. We're reporting on money that's being spent, decisions that boards are considering. The other kind of complaint we heard a lot was that we were too liberal. I have these two examples. The second one doesn't trust the media because we're always lying to people. We wanted to be able to reach more people in our media. Basically every media. We wanted people reading our products, engaging with us, being engaged citizens. So we decided to tackle these two. The first one, we don't know what's happening. We, for many years, sorry, my.
Now we can't hear you.
We lost you. Nope.
Okay. Sarah, we can't hear you. I'm not, just keep trying and figure it out. But so yeah, I mean, you guys have all heard this. We don't know what information is, we don't know what's going on in the community. And to us, it's just absolutely bang your head against the wall, right? We've been, especially at traditional newspaper outlets, we've been doing it the same way, or added different materials, different products over the years. And it's really hard to understand how people don't know where to turn. People have become more reliant on social media. They think that everything they need is right there and it's going to pop up in their feed. That's, we all know, not the case. So we tried to do some things differently. I talked to the group about being an avid and fast paywall, right? I think that we do need to charge for our materials, but that doesn't mean that people who are not willing to or are not, in line to pay for what you're providing shouldn't know what's out there. So we took our daily newsletter and made that free. You could still sign up, get it via email every morning, and get kind of a snapshot of what was going on in the community on a daily basis for a weekly newspaper. It's a 5-day a week offering. I see she keeps on moving her lips there, but you just had to turn the light on, didn't you? And it was really, really well received. It also was well received within the school district. A lot of teachers that we felt should be, privy to the information that we were providing came out of the woodwork. They started signing up. I think we had 1,500 people sign up for the free daily newspaper that had not received it previously. This is for a 3,000 circulation weekly newspaper. I more than doubled the circulation or the reach of the newsletter itself, which gave it more value to advertisers. All of a sudden, this product that we knew had really great value because people loved it and told us that they loved it over and over, was more readily available to a wider public. It also allowed, like you guys from around the country, to check on what was going on and what we were trying to do journalistically. So that was a really successful effort that Sara spearheaded. I think that's just more about we don't know what's happening.
Okay.
Yeah, so we don't trust you, and I talked a little bit about this, and I wish that Sara was on here, but this is very much in line with what we were talking about before. We did get that kind of feedback. We reached out to individuals for the Trusting News Project. We did some interviews. I did some of those interviews, and it was really difficult, but it was also a great learning for us to kind of get a little more insight into productive conversations with people who disagreed with us. Just having the conversation itself, even if we could reach the we're going to have to agree to disagree stage, was productive. Those people really appreciated that we reached out to them. We did so by kind of putting a survey out there. Would you be willing to talk to us if you are coming from a more conservative viewpoint, because you've been critical of our work in the past? They came to us. They gave us their contact information. They volunteered for that, and it ended up being a really productive thing. One of the things that came out of it was Sara won a lot of awards for her coverage of COVID in Hardin County, and really across the state. She started to she was keeping tabs on the local numbers as well as the state numbers. She started to notice some irregularities. She caught the state doing some things that were, not exactly kosher with how they were reporting numbers. Yes.
Hey, sorry. It was muted and wouldn't let me unmute.
Okay, we don't need you to share your screen again because we can see the slides. Okay?
Yep.
Okay. So go ahead.
Okay, so Tony was talking, I wanted to go back to, sorry, I've been trying to figure out my audio. When we participated with Trusting News, it was on their Re-engaging the Right project, which was all about one of those first slides that Elizabeth showed that showed the divide between whether people who identified as conservative or people who identified as liberal trusted the news. And it was trying to re-engage with those people who identified as conservative, who the survey showed, it's up there now, I think. It was a Pew survey that showed very few people who are conservative trusted the news. So really drilling into that and figuring out why they didn't trust us. And like Tony said, people filled out a survey and they agreed to be interviewed by us about their opinions around the news. And by and large, we found that a lot of them did trust us. But we also noticed some, they would say, oh, I mostly trust you. I read you because I want to know about the local news. But they also said things like, when you put certain words in quotation marks in stories, that makes me upset. So you can see on this slide, I had written this story, that first screenshot up at the top that includes cancel culture in quotes. It was a school board meeting and they were talking about why a school bond hadn't passed. And this woman was saying that that people don't want to speak up in opposition to the bond because of cancel culture. I was reporting that. She said cancel culture. To me, it was a very specific meaning, and I put it in quotation marks. And somebody else, and it wasn't her that I was interviewing, it was someone else during these Re-engaging the Right interviews said, when I saw that in quotation marks, I took that as an insult against people who believe that there is a cancel culture. I had never thought about it that way. As a journalist, I was pulling it out of a quote, and actually the next paragraph, which you can't see in the screenshot, is a direct quote from what she said. Kind of something that journalists just do. And I didn't think that about the ways that it could be seen as kind of a slight about what she was saying. There's also another screenshot at the bottom. This is pulled from the report that Trusting News did as a result of our participation in re-engaging the right. And one of the women I interviewed said there's a lot of different kinds of conservatives and they just lump them all together as the right-wing extremists. And it, like Peter said, when you hear criticism like this and other kinds of criticism, it is hard to hear because I think by and large, most journalists believe that they are doing a good job and they're being fair and accurate. But the way that we're perceived is not always as fair and accurate. And so coming to terms with the fact that they're not seeing us that way, and then trying to make a plan for adjusting so that you can meet those people and build trust in them is difficult. So that led to the Trusting News project, the Road to Pluralism, which Elizabeth also referenced in her introduction. We participated with Trusting News and did a project where for 6 weeks we would pick 3 or 4 stories a week and go through a checklist with those stories. It encouraged us to look at the sources that we were talking to. Were they sources on all different sides of an issue? It asked us to look at what stories we were reporting and why we were reporting it, really taking a deep dive instead of just reporting the news, printing it and being done with it, then looking at it and saying, did we really do a good job of representing all the different perspectives on this issue? And it's not an easy process, but I found it really helpful. It asked us to look at the headlines we were using, the quotes that we were choosing, the sources. And all of that I think is helpful. Personally, after I talked to that woman about the interviewee about the cancel culture quote, I started thinking about how I was using quotes almost every time I used them. If I pulled a 2 or 3 word phrase out of a quote to put it in like its own quotes, I would think about how might this be perceived by somebody who has different opinions. So I pulled this newspaper article on the right. For some local residents, vaccines aren't worth the risk. This story was a direct result of the interviews that we did on the Re-engaging the Right project. One of the women I talked to said, you only write about how good the vaccines are and how terrible COVID is, and you never represent the opinions of the people who don't want to get the vaccine. And I had a long conversation with her about where we were coming from and why we were reporting what we were reporting. And she had issues with a lot of our COVID reporting. And I told her, it's hard for us to find people who are opposed to the vaccine because a lot of them are sending us anonymous comments and emails. And eventually I talked to her enough that she helped put me in touch with some different people who didn't intend to get the vaccine. And this story was the result. Now I would add that I didn't just talk to the people who were opposed to getting the vaccine. I also included information from the CDC and from local doctors. So that's that second bullet. We reported with facts. It was important to me that we present this opinion and this perspective, but also balance it with facts, just as we do with a lot of our reporting. And so that was a direct result of our work with Re-engaging the Right. And sorry, I'm a little bit out of order with my slides, but some other things that we did is when we did this deep dive and looked at how we were reporting and whether we were reporting all of the opinions and experiences in our community, moving forward, we worked to listen to people more when they called to complain about our coverage or wrote to us. There's that tendency in a lot of newsrooms to say, oh, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, or they don't understand. I think Peter referenced that when he was talking about the criticism of their coverage. But listening to that criticism and determining whether it comes from a real place and whether there's some legitimacy to it and whether we can change our practices to be more inclusive. We reported with facts. We strive to be more transparent. I think that there's an issue, and I know I'm not alone in this, and it's been written about and talked about a lot, that the journalism industry does a terrible job of being transparent in most cases about how we report the news. So I think there were so many times that people called me and said, I have a story idea. I don't know how you go about finding stories for the newspaper. And to me, it seemed obvious, like things happen and we report them, or somebody tells us about a great story. But not everyone understands that. Not everyone knows a journalist. Not everyone has interacted with the newspaper. And so I think being more transparent about how we find stories, how we report them, who we are as journalists in the community, and that can take all kinds of different forms. That can be being more involved in your community. It can be running profile pieces or house ads about your journalists. It can be writing columns or having the editor write columns about how you reported a specific piece of journalism. And then we joined the road to pluralism. I think I don't want to say that we figured everything out, because we definitely did not. But I think that we made some good efforts, and I think that we gained some trust from people who didn't previously trust us or even pay attention to what we were publishing. And I think that it's a constant process. I'm probably going to feel differently about this in 3 months. Like, why weren't you doing this thing also? But I think the practice of evaluating how you're doing your job and adjusting it and talking to people and getting that feedback is always going to help us be more representative of our communities and also better journalists. I don't know if you can all still hear me.
What the divide means within any given community. So we've talked about race, we've talked politics, and truthfully, you guys can come up with a dozen more answers. It depends on what your community looks like, what it feels like, what it's dealing with, right? We're all dealing with different kinds of divides, but the through line between what we've talked about, what Peter talked about, what Elizabeth talked about, and what we heard in the boots on the ground, personal interaction. And that's where community journalists are in a much better position than, daily newspapers that maybe have been cut to the bone by ownership over the last 20 years. Community newspapers have those neighborly relationships with people, and if they're willing to continue to go out of their comfort zone, talk to new people, talk to different people within the community about what their grievances are with the coverage and with what's happening in their town, you're really you're in a position to build on the trust that exists and fairly successful.
All right. Thanks. And I'm glad, apologies, but I think we'll go ahead and take questions. I don't know what we have, but I see one behind you, Terry.
Thank you all for being so patient with the technology stuff.
Hi, I have a question for Peter. So you talked about the document BLM, and after you did the deep dive into which demographics were being reported on and how, what were you guys? Did you change anything in like the daily coverage of the Black and Brown communities at the day? Because it seems like a lot of the issues from that stem from just the day-to-day coverage and not like the bigger stories.
You're right that is the bigger challenge, and I'm not sure that I can point to one specific thing. I think that it's something that we're aware of and that we talk about all the time and struggle with how to put it into action. I think one of the challenges, so Sarah talked about like how we come up with story ideas. Taking a closer look at how we all have personal and professional circles that I think we we lean on maybe too much when we're looking for story ideas or looking for sources or contacts. Going back to that story about downtown residents being afraid of crime, that was a story that was assigned in the morning, and the person had to go out that day. So he was like, where in the middle of the day do I know that I can find downtown residents gathering, that I can talk to them about how they feel? I think that had he wanted to try, like, where can I go find Black and Hispanic downtown residents to get their opinions? Like, I'm not sure that we've done the work to like say, I know outside of the usual sources who to go to. So we were a part of some of the same Trusting News projects, and that's some of the criticism that we heard, was that, like, even when you go to talk to people in the Black community, it's the same community leaders over and over again, and like that's a person who I don't feel like speaks for me. We have, it's not day-to-day coverage, it is more special project coverage, but we have devoted special sections to a couple of different groups. So like we did a special section for Black History Month. We did a special section for Hispanic Heritage Month. We did a special section for Pride Month. We have another section coming up that's going to be all Native American stories in our community. We did start a community advisory board for issues of diversity, so that while we don't have a lot of Black representation in our newsroom, we at least have a board of members of our community, local residents who are Black and Hispanic, who have given us some insight and given us story ideas. So I guess if I was going to point to one thing that we've done with daily coverage, I'm not a part of that diversity advisory board, but I know I have heard from reporters that there have been story ideas generated through that, and they have talked about how we handle coverage, steps, made improvements. I think there's a long way to go, and every time we talk about hiring, that's something that I really try to bring up. And I think everybody agrees that we need to attract a more diverse pool of talent, because in our newsroom we should look more like the community that we along lines of race. I think along the lines of ideology, life experience. I mean, we cover a military community. We have a shipyard and a submarine base, and I don't know of anyone on our staff that has ever been in the military. So there are a lot of different things that we could do to make our newsroom more representative. Unfortunately, that's a very slow process.
Peter, could you talk a little bit about the Day's unusual ownership structure and how that may ease the way for doing the kind of major project that you did?
Yes. So the Day is owned by a split interest trust. So basically what that means is we have a few shareholders, I think family descendants of the original publisher who in his will set up this trust arrangement, but we basically have a board of directors. The profits from our business get reinvested into the business, and then a portion of the profits go into the Bodenwind Benevolent Foundation, which distributes a portion of our profits to nonprofit community organizations. So we're not a big corporation. I think that we face the same economic challenges that small outlets face. And I guess I don't know specifically, is it because of that ownership situation, or is it just the culture that we've had in the newsroom? So I've worked at the Day for 15 years, and there has always been a newsroom culture of experimentation and trying new things and trying big things. And some of them work better than others. The challenge on the financial side, like, is this something that's going to lead to more revenue? I think with the documentary, there was some pie in the sky thinking that, like, hey, this is going to get picked up by Netflix or some streaming service, and it was going to be a big moneymaker. And no one in our company has any experience in film distribution. So that's been a challenge. We've developed our own on-demand pay-per-view platform. But yes, I think you're right that we have a very unique ownership structure, and it does allow us to do some different things.
So this point of view is from Rob Birch. He'd like to pose it to the panel for some feedback. From Rob, I feel a need to point out that the question of ideological trust is in some ways a journalistic first world problem. Many of us live in news deserts where chains have left only a single young reporter to cover our entire community. We lose dialogue and sense of community as a result, and existing divisions can only deepen. Without a solid financial model, we'd be grateful for any reporting. To argue about bias and ideology would be a privilege.
I mean, absolutely no argument from anybody up here on that. And the truth is, it is absolutely a first world problem, and we're very grateful for the opportunities that we have to do good work for good organizations with unique ownership structures. I said earlier, the Gazette is an ESOP. It's privately, it's independent, and that is absolutely true of the best organizations, the best news organizations across the board, across the country. Obviously, the day is the same. I don't know them, but there are really smart people like Penny Abernathy working on it, trying to figure it out. And I don't think we're going to be able to solve it today.
But I do think this conversation, yes, it is a privilege to have, but I think you mentioned too, like, we have to realize what is going on in our adapt and grow, and we can't expect that audiences are going to come to us naturally anyway, that unless we are making this effort broadening what we cover and what we look at, either by expanding geographically or really doing the hard work of getting into communities that we have struggled as often predominantly white newsrooms to work with and help tell their stories, then we're kind of missing opportunities all around. So
we are. I think we have to think a little bit about how we tell our own stories, because we can't make that product pitch anymore. Like, I remember how thick my 25-cent daily newspaper was when I was younger, and now I know what my $1.50 daily newspaper looks like. So like that's feedback we hear all the time, and I think we have to frame the story as like this: we still serve a vital and important role in our community, and if you think that's important, we need your support.
I'm up. Oh, that was loud. So kind of a question for Tony and maybe Sarah, if technology bears with us, is when you made that kind of change away from a paywall for your daily newsletter and just that ongoing transparency work with your readers, how did you tell them about that? And how did you convey that not only internet with a medium, but also your print readers who might not have access?
I think I can answer that if you can hear me. I wrote a column about it. It was my proposal, and I wrote a column for print and online, explaining why, because we didn't want to just say, hey, now it's free. We wanted to explain. And I had been reporting on the conversations in the community that were happening, where people were saying, I don't know what's happening in town. I don't know when these public meetings are being held. And so I wrote a column that said, listen, we've talked about this. We want our community to be more informed, and the people who want to get the information, we want to provide that information. This is the part of the presentation where you couldn't hear me, I think, but Tony said we wanted to provide it to people whether they wanted to pay for the newspaper, and I would add whether they could pay for the newspaper, because Iowa Falls has a pretty high percentage of kids who are on free and reduced price lunch. Poverty is an issue, and there are some people who cannot afford to buy the newspaper. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't know what's happening in their community. And so by making that newsletter free, we, a lot of our stories were still paywalled, but there were things that were not paywalled. Meeting announcements, any kind of elections coverage, we made free. All of our COVID reporting, things that we felt were a public service and a public need, the information that people really needed to know, we put in front of the paywall because we wanted to remove as many barriers as we could from people getting involved. We want them to know, hey, there's an election coming up on a school bond and it would raise your taxes this much, but here's what it would provide. We want people to have that information. So we communicated it in print in a column, we put it online and put it in front of the paywall, and also use social media to push out our message that we wanted people, we were doing this to help inform our community.
A radio station, a terrestrial radio station. So basically, we blasted it on every channel that we could think of to get it out there to those people. Sarah has a great story about a guy who walked in front of a school board meeting and said, well, I don't get the newspaper, I don't check my email, and I don't answer my cell phone. So how are you going to get that stuff to me? Oh, I have a post office box, check that. How are you going to get information to me? Okay. At some point, people have to take ownership for, but when it comes to something like that, especially giving something away, trying to help the community in any way we can, we put it out there every single way we can think of, get it out there. We ask our partners to help get it out there. We had some really good relationships in Iowa Falls. Bank presidents, stuff like that. They were sharing that stuff on Facebook and saying, hey, if you're not getting this, get this because it's great. Yeah.
So I have a question for Tony or Sarah or anybody who's been through the Trusting News initiatives. How is that informing looking forward to your coverage of the upcoming election, particularly issues with respect to voting integrity?
That's the editor's area.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I was turning the lights back on in this room.
Plans for upcoming election coverage, especially election integrity, the Trusting News findings.
I'm sorry, there's a delay. You're asking about the plans for election coverage?
How your work with Trusting News is impacting the coverage you're doing for elections.
Well, I've been in this job for about 2.5 months, so I'm still the newbie, but I think I'm not sure that, gosh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that the work that we did on re-engaging the right and the pluralism work we did applies as much to election coverage. The work that we specifically did at the Times Citizen, the Pluralism Project, has a lot of different facets to it. I think that talking to, well, I don't know. This is a good question. I'm not exactly sure how to answer it. I can direct you to all kinds of great work that Trusting News has done about election coverage, but I think the policy of trying to engage with as many readers from different experiences and life perspectives as possible, as well as candidates and voters, applies to everything that we do and should apply to everything that we do. We should strive to always talk with more people from different perspectives and not the same people all the time. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm sorry.
I can chime in a little bit there. So I was involved in some of the same Engaging the Right and Road to Pluralism interview projects with Trusting News. And so one small thing that I can say that we've specifically done, this year, unfortunately, we're not hosting the same candidate debates that we have in the past, just because of staffing and logistical issues. But we've invited all of our local candidates to come in for video interviews. and we developed a list of questions for those interviews. And looking over the questions, based on some of the feedback I had heard, there were a couple of the questions that seemed like they could be interpreted as having a real partisan bent. Like, this Republican candidate said this, the Republican candidate for governor says he's going to do this, like, do you agree? Or the Democratic candidate for governor wants to propose this, do you agree? And that setup for a question felt like there was a partisan bent behind it. And so we talked about, like, how could we reword these questions to make it be like, what is your position as a candidate about these issues? Or what were other national buzzword issues that when we thought about it really didn't have any relevance to races in Connecticut. Second thing, which is not a matter, but what I want to encourage my colleagues, editors and reporters in the newsroom, is to think about the language we use in reporting on election stories and take away, when we can, some of the win-loss battle for a seat. Like, talk about, somebody was, voters chose this person, not so-and-so won their fight against this person. Because that's what we heard from readers, that they see this really charged language from us as reporters. We're trying to add colorful language to make our writing more interesting. But it seems like we're framing things as a fight or a battle, and that just charges people up. That's something we've talked about a little bit. I am making a note to myself that when I get back in the newsroom to bring that up again. But that's something that we heard.
Yeah, and I will say there's some good programs out there. In 2020, I participated in Elections SOS that came from Harkin, and there's been more iterations of that, but engaged elections. And the focus really was on issues and asking, the reporting is around issues and less horse race, and those issues we engaged our readership with. So we asked them, what are the issues that are important to you? Why are they important to you? And what do you need to know from a candidate about this issue to make an informed decision? So those are things we have continued to do since 2020 in the state elections, and also our municipal elections of taking that issues-based approach. And I do think that makes a difference. We are over time. We took a little bit longer because of our technical difficulties, but we had a few takeaways just that we wanted to kind of reiterate from the conversations that we had here. That this is kind of I think the things that we took away from the trusting news and the conversations having with readers and those who don't trust media is just, and the differences in our communities of just being aware of them, thinking about who you're talking to, who's missing, what language are we using, how can we be more direct and clear in our reporting and our writing in the questions we're asking. Talk to your community. I think trusting news, it really was about conversations when these news outlets participated in that, and it gave them structure and accountability, which is great. It doesn't have to be through a program like that. You can be having these conversations on your own, making sure you're hearing from people, taking that extra step, like Sara said, of when someone complains, really talk to them more than just, okay, thanks for calling and telling us and blowing it off. And then wherever we can be open and transparent about our processes, because not everyone knows how journalism works and how we operate in our newsroom involved. And so the more transparent we can be about that, the more we can inform the people reading it, clear up some confusion, and kind of be straight with them in what we're doing, that it's not behind a black box to them. So that's what we have. So thank you all for your patience with the technology, and we appreciate your time today.
So thanks so much to Elizabeth, Tony, Peter, and Sara. I think she's left us, but And I appreciate your patience, as Elizabeth said, for what I thought was a pretty interesting presentation and certainly something to give us a lot to think about. We're going to take about a 15-minute break between now and the next session, so there should still be some coffee, soft drinks, and water out there for you folks if you're interested, but let's try to regather here, about 3:30. That'd be great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for working through that.